I think that there's too much stanza breaks, like it just kind of goes off.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of stanza breaks, and maybe those couplets, even though there's a kind of obvious gimmick to them, like they make sense on that surface level, maybe the stanza breaks aren't really serving. Okay, so maybe reconsider the stanzas. What else? Yeah.
The amount of words that like are italicized that the native speaker is saying, and like the translator is relaying to everyone, it was kind of like a little bit distracting.
Yeah, all those italics. So I wanted to italicize phrases to represent the texture of language, right? Because when we pull a phrase from another language, we italicize it. But it's visually distracting. It's a lot of clutter on the page, and I was very sensitive to that. So absolutely. What else isn't working? Are there certain things that aren't clear narratively where you're not quite sure what's going on?
Yeah.
Yeah?
There's just like one little portion, like the communist fire truck and the African Tito, like I understand
Yeah.
what he was trying to say, but it was like, why is that in there, you know?
Exactly. And part of that is that, remember, for me as the writer, my inspiration point was a poet, watching a Korean poet read. And so for me, those kind of weird collisions of language made sense because in my head, the profession that the translations were coming from was the world of poetry. There's nothing in the poem to indicate that for my reader. And so it's a bunch of non sequiturs. It's like, what on earth does this guy do for a living? That he has a boss, but he's talking about African tea kettles and communist fire trucks. I mean, you can work at it. You can work at the idea of, okay, communism is associated with the color red. Fire trucks are associated with the color red. Or African and tea kettle, or maybe being a color stand-in for black. Like, but it's weird and it's stretchy and it's not quite right. So I agree. These were all things that caused me. I wrote this poem. I posted it to my blog by like 11:50 p.m. I went to bed. I woke up the next day and I thought, nah, that just didn't quite work. There were I liked some of it, but I don't know that death thing really makes sense. I showed it to a few trusted readers and they didn't quite know what was happening there or if anything really was happening. And so I put it away. I woke up the next morning and I had another poem to write. And it sat in a drawer and it stayed in a drawer for a number of weeks and maybe even a number of months. But I took it out and I said, okay, I know there was something I liked about this poem. And that's often, here's something that I will tell you right now. There are many talented people who can write great first drafts. The people who will become poets are the ones who fall in love with the act of revision. If you can't fall a little in love with the revision and the attention to detail and the working and the reworking, you won't make it no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how musical your ear is. There is an element of perseverance that is the key. I was not the most talented poet in my undergrad school. I was the one who worked really hard, and I was stubborn. And the stubbornness that is at the core of the revision process is kind of why I'm here now. So, I was stubborn. I said, there's something I like about that poem. I don't know quite what it is, but I'm going to try to revise it. And that delivers us to the second draft. So I'm going to read that one, and then what I want you to do is I want you to tell me what you noticed changed and why it might have changed, and what stayed the same.
Can I interject something really quickly?
Yeah.
When I 2-3 years ago, we were reading Cherry Tomatoes. We were talking about the poem, and in creative writing, and I said, what would be awesome? I don't know if it was last year, Paige, and maybe you were in this class, but it'd be great if, since I use so much of her poetry and love to work with it, if she had some drafts, early drafts that were available. And then I was like, if any poet had that would be something. To be able to say, oh, check out how it went from here to here to here. And that's when somebody's like, why didn't you email her? And I remember that I felt heat, embarrassed heat, and I was like her woman? I mean, I'm like, it is 2014, I guarantee she has an email address. And by the way, you responded for 2 hours. And I was like, I can't email today, I'm not ready. But last night, Sandra said she was going to do this, and I was like, that is exactly where this all came from. Because, of course, revision, how do you teach revision? I mean, but it's the thing, right? So this moment is gigantically important for I think any writer, and especially for us, having the poems we've looked at. Focus hard on this and try to look for the things that have changed and why. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that. I will, because I will point out, maybe it's important, I hope it's helpful. It is tremendously vulnerable for me. Like, if you'd asked me to send this to you blind over email, I'm not sure I would have been willing to, because it's dirty laundry. It's like passing out imperfect versions. And so I will, if you all remind me, when we're done looking at this and before we turn to your work, I will tell you a very brief, somewhat humiliating story involving Billy Collins. Okay. The second draft of The Translator. At first, it was just for lectures, then office hours, then vacations, then supermarkets, then home. He hired me to carry his words in my mouth, in my hands, words like stones skipping across a lake to the farthest shore. My job was to give him the color of sky, the cut of beef, thank you, please, tea kettle, fire truck, tango, spider. I lived in his basement, I ate at his table. Before long, I knew the language of his sighs, when to order takeout, when to play Stravinsky. One night, hearing his briefcase's sad click against the counter, I turned to his wife and translated, "He's leaving you." Okay, what is different? What's changed? Yeah.
You can really see the connection between the translator and the native speaker now, like how close he became from like just having it really like distant and like a few feet away at like a big room like a lecture, and then when he's sitting at his table and you're across from someone, just the intimacy.
Yeah, so it's much clearer, this progression, this acceleration of intimacy between the native speaker and the translator. And that is in large part because of that first stanza, right? It's methodical. It lays out all the varying levels of interaction, going from lectures to home. So yes, what else? Yeah.
Wait.
Second draft.
Yeah, second draft. What did I forget? Oh, yeah. Oh, no.
This is so Dirk, by the way. What's happening?
Yeah.
Exactly, Dirk.
That's annoying.
The video camera is getting a beautiful top-down.
Yeah.
I know. Well, look at his hair. I mean, that's not a bad shot.
Just curls.
we can circle around. And whatever it is you might have your eye on right now will probably change or stay the same between this and the final.
Oh, I got it. Finally. You went from second person to first.
Oh.
From second person to first, yeah, so it goes from being the you to being the I. It becomes a testimony of sorts, right? And it shifts into, if the first draft was kind of in the positional present tense, you do this, this happens. The second one is told in past tense, right? At first it was just for lectures. He hired me to carry his words in my mouth. Okay, yeah, so we've changed tense, we've changed voice. What else has changed? Yeah.
I feel at the end that image got a lot stronger, and it kind of leaves the reader with like a sense of how intense the actual relationship was. Whereas in the first draft, you use that bookend.
Okay. Yeah, so I've abandoned the bookend symmetry, trying to create closure through symmetry, and instead, when you say the image, what image are you talking about?
I turn to his wife and translate easily. I feel like that just in my head is kind of like,
Yeah.
I could feel or like I could picture that.
Okay, so this is important. So in the first version, there was this issue of maybe some type of medical crisis, maybe some type. What is the core narrative drama here? What's happening? They're getting a divorce, or there's some split in the marriage. Let's come back to that. So, but for now, the death has been put aside. Yeah.
Well, in the first one, it's kind of like seeing the translator and like doesn't really understand the guy. Like they're kind of like arguing with each other. But in the second draft, they're like intertwined. Like he has a very close relationship with them. But yeah, at the end, they're both like leaving the wife. So
this time like the tension seems to revolve around the wife rather than within the relationship between the native speaker and the translator. What structurally on the page, what has changed about the form of the poem that might indicate that shift? Yeah.
Well, it's different in that the second draft is in triplets rather than couplets.
Yeah.
It's also different in the second draft. It's much more methodical with changing from a business relationship to a personal relationship. Because in the first one, it's talking. It mostly utilizes the italics and what he's actually translating to show the shift in relationship, whereas the other one kind of lays it out in the first stanza.
The cast is more complicated now, and the poem is formally enacting that because we moved into terces, 3-line stanzas instead of couplets, 2-line stanzas. In addition, we've gotten rid of what's happened to the italics. Greatly reduced, right? There's still some of the ideas. Yeah, what did you want to
So like the first one, I kind of felt like it was just him saying these things and not really having anything tied to them. But then the second one, when you like cut out most of the italics, but you list how he's saying them or like how it kind of shows how he feels about them. It kind of like puts more emotion into how the translator is like with the native speaker. So like the first one was just kind of like, I can't breathe. The second one was him describing how he would have to deliver it kind of thing.
Yeah, no, this idea of like the words like stones and the idea that the italics have been reduced, but the ideas behind the italics are still in play. Yeah.
So the first draft is a lot more like the job description of the translator, and like the physicalness of like saying the words. But the second draft is much more like closer together and closer and involves like what happens over time in the development of the position rather than the position itself.
I lived in his basement. I ate at his table. Before long, I knew the language of his size. When to order takeout, when to play Stravinsky. So takeout and Stravinsky are just quirky things that we're going to say in the poem no matter what. And I think that as poets, we should be loyal to, when people say first thought, best thought, I kind of cringe sometimes because sometimes that's an excuse to keep kind of sloppy construction of ideas or arguments. But I think that if there's often the smallest, strangest, most random details in your first draft are the details that make that poem your own. And sometimes you have to be loyal to them, just almost stubbornly, to use that word again.
And just to go back, a lot of beginning poets, from what I've seen, no doubt what you've seen, it's something that I call thinginess. We want I was going to say, you need things. There's in so many beginning poems. So we talk about the ladder of abstraction. We talk about this idea that you've got it, that the bottom of the ladder is the things, the objects, the tangibles, and the top are these abstract concepts. And you should move between them and showing and telling, but a lot of times the first drafts don't have any things in them. You won't get Stravinsky and you won't get ordering takeout. So I don't know what I'm saying, but we don't even sometimes have that. Sometimes those thoughts aren't in there. You know what I mean?
What you're thinking of as things and thinginess, I call bright particulars. And I will say, we were talking at the break about, the kind of how do you develop as a poet, and I was saying that I think of it like developing a set of muscles, and over time those muscles acquire memory, and certain motions and gestures you know how to do more easily. What I would say was, if I had been an even more beginning poet, a lot of times in the first draft, what I would have is not bright particulars, but placeholders where bright particulars should be. So align the very, 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 very first draft from when I was 16 would have said putting music on, not putting Stravinsky on. And you'd have gotten an idea, but you wouldn't have gotten the satisfaction of that particular set of vowels and consonants and cultural connotations. So that's something where my muscle memory has developed to the point where I know to push myself to put a more specific word in. But just because you might not be there yet doesn't mean that you won't develop that same muscle memory. Okay, so we've talked about many things that have changed, some things that have stayed the same, certain small elements. What's wrong with this poem? What don't you, because I didn't think this was done when I finished it. What are some of the ways in which this second draft of the poem is not quite working?
Take out the wife.
Take out the wife.
Yeah.
Okay.
She's like that
Poor wife.
deal,
She's clunky. Maybe she's cluttering up the poem. Okay, so maybe the wife is bringing certain values to the poem, and maybe she's costing certain values to the poem. What else might not be working? You know what I heard a lot of people do? Turn the page, right? Yeah, that's because the poem seems to be mysteriously done, and yet it didn't quite end, right? Yeah.
I don't know, it just seemed kind of weird that he'd be married to someone who doesn't speak.
Okay. Yes, logical difficulty. It's one thing, you know, would somebody, it's one thing to know someone who doesn't speak your language. To actually marry them? Like there's a kind, it's a narrative stretch I think you're raising, and that's a really important question of like, huh? You know, so that's, and then there's the problem of the ending. Basically, when you see an ellipse, dot, 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 a lot of times we use that to indicate passage of time. Ideally, when we're quoting, we might do dot, 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 and then pick up from later in the quotation. This is me realizing that in trying to write a poem, I've inadvertently begun a short story. And I am not a short story writer. And I don't know where to take the fiction, the narrative of this poem in the space of poetry. All of a sudden, it's getting bigger and bigger, and I don't know how to spool it in. So that dot, 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 that ellipse, is my gesture of, gosh, I really don't quite know how to end this. And I'm also realizing some of these other problems that have been raised. So again, I finished the poem, liked it, didn't love it, put it away. Said, nah, maybe that one just didn't work. Now, fast forward, and I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to publish a book. I was the jukebox and been accepted, but I needed more poems for it. It wasn't quite working. So I was like, I've got to go through some of these old drafts that I, wondered if I was going to make work. I've got to see. So that led me to this third final version, which was published in a journal and then was in a book, of the translator. So if you flip the page, you'll see it. And once again, I'm going to ask what has changed, what has stayed the same. The translator. He paid me to carry his words in my mouth, to give him the cut of sky, the color of beef, to give him please, to give him thank you, to give him tea kettle, spider, tango. I ate at his table, I moved into his basement. I made a dictionary of size, when to order takeout, when to play Stravinsky, when to tell the woman to take her clothes and go. Soon he was dying. I can't breathe, he said, so I said, I can't breathe. My heart, he said, so I said, my heart. It was my wrist the nurse held, my chest under the stethoscope. I'm sorry, said the doctor, and my throat became a coffin they could not open. Okay, what has changed? What has changed? What's different from the last version? Yeah?
It's way more clear who actually died.
Way more clear who actually died. I decided I missed the risk, I missed the drama of that first version, but I had to make it work better. And the decision that I made was that if I doubled, this is a short poem. This is not a lot of words on the page. My decision was that if I literally doubled the phrases as they were said first by the native speaker and then by the translator, it would kind of make it more of a scene rather than an idea. And you really notice it, and I actually massaged the line breaks so that those phrases literally sit on top of each other. It's that repetition's really visual. So good. So maybe I rescued that earlier ending and maybe made it a little bit more apparent. What happened to the wife? Is she gone or is she there? Yes.
She became the woman.
She became the woman. She was demoted. It was a little too much for the stanza, for the poem to have three different characters. So I made her kind of a more diminutive presence. She's simply the woman. And that addresses the point you made. To marry someone with whom you don't share language, that's a little problematic. To share a single evening with someone with whom you don't share a language, plausible, especially if you're a sailor. Okay, what else is different? Yeah.
This is really tiny, but I liked it a lot. Instead of saying I lived in his basement, you said I moved into his basement, and I think it shows like the transition of their relationship a lot better.
Yeah, it actually kind of activates the moment rather than just observing it. Great, I appreciate it. I like it when you all make me sound smart. Yeah, thank you. What would be something else? Yeah.
I think as far as flowing, like visually it flows without, taking away those breaks in between it, but also just kind of verbally, like, especially the repetition, it all very much, like you said, sits on top of each other, but just it flows so much easier so where you can really follow the poem and then at the very end it hits you, rather than kind of reading a couplet, then a couplet, then a couplet, and then questioning in between, so it just flows very nicely.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like in the second draft, I felt like I had discovered that I wanted it to be in first person. And it occurred to me that in the tradition, we have a tradition of what they call the dramatic monologue, which is as much from the world of the stage and of playwriting as it is from poetry. And it's the idea of I am going to stand here as a presence and share my story with you. And you don't use stanza breaks in the dramatic monologue because you don't want to remind people that what they're reading is a page presence. You want it to be a stage presence. And so that's why I simplified in terms of I got rid of all the stanza breaks. Now the trick is, when you give up an ordering structure like stanza breaks, you have to then add, you have to balance, you have to bring in an ordering structure that maybe wasn't there. Is there a way in which this poem is arranged or phrased that adds order from how it was in previous versions? Yeah, to give him please, to give him thank you, to give him tea kettle, spider, tango, I ate, I moved, I made. We call that anaphora, when a series of lines begin in the same way. It's something that Allen Ginsberg did a lot, something that Walt Whitman did a lot. It's something that is a way of ordering language, creating these parallel structures and this flow. Yeah. Anything else that you noticed that's changed? Yeah, and then, yeah.
I really liked how you went instead of the color of the sky and the cut of beef to the cut of the sky and the color of the beef, because that kind of has like the confusion between language translations, but it also gives like another beautiful image, just like this slice of sky.
Yeah, I wanted to simplify in the second draft, but I realized I had maybe oversimplified in some ways. So then how could I recomplicate? And I realized that if I just kind of switched between color of sky and cut of beef, the thing is that if you work with it, it does work. Because when we talk about cloud formation in the sky, we're talking about the sky's cut, if you want to look at the sky as a textile. When we talk about beef in terms of the amount of marbling, the amount of fat in it, we're talking about it in terms of color. So there's ways you can make it work, but it's just a little, I mean, I am a poet. I gotta be a little weird. That's how this works. Yeah, what's that?
That was the same thing I was going to say.
All right, well, good. Other things, yeah.
I don't really know why I like this so much, but I just really like the line, I made a dictionary of sighs. I just kind of feel like it's more permanent kind of thing, like when it's a language, it's just you're speaking it, and it's like people are like trying to understand what you are, but like when you write a dictionary, you're kind of writing it all out, you're putting it down on paper, so it's just like, it's used over time. I don't know why I like that so much. But.
Okay, so this is actually, I want to make this clear. A lot of times when we read poems in books by poets, we think, oh, that's cool what they did there, right? And we just somehow assume that they magically did it on their very first try. So this idea of dictionary of sighs, if you look back to the first draft, it says your job is to tell the sigh that means put on this from the sigh that means order takeout. So there's an idea there, right? Second draft, the idea of the sighs, before long I knew the language of his sighs. So I've gotten a little more sophisticated. I've gone from telling to language. And it was only at that point that I realized, oh, do we have a name for when we gather up all the different ways to understand language in one place? Yeah, we do. It's that whole little dictionary thing, right? So I think it's a metaphor that really works. It's a metaphor that it took me 3 and probably even more tries to discover. And I think it's really important when you read something that you admire or want to emulate on the page in a poem, recognize that it might have taken the poet a lot of go-rounds to get there. And don't think that just because you don't get it in that first draft or the first time that it's not going to work. Yeah. Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, you look at this poem that you have, and it was in the book, and it was in the magazine. Do you ever think, oh, I could edit it even more, I could go further?
Sure. I mean, we always revisit these questions. This one I feel pretty good about, but for example, Unit of Measure, which I read the last time we were gathered together, I still look at that one and I want to play with the line breaks of it, and I still have poems that when I read it aloud, I add certain phrases or I take out certain phrases, just because I've realized that there's another version of the poem that I'd like to see out in the world. So yeah, I mean, this quote is variously attributed to a lot of different people, but it's this idea of no work is ever finished, only abandoned. Like you just, at some point you have to move on and become more in love with the next thing you want to write. But yeah, we always revisit.
Okay, and then I have another question. So when you revise, you're talking a lot about like the structure and what's actually in the poem, but you didn't stray far or too far from what you originally wanted to say. Do you ever have to break up with what you originally wanted to say to get the poem across?
Sure, and breaking up is a great metaphor to use because it's painful. And you're like, I wasted all that time,
This is better than killing your children, now that I think about it. I like that better. Maybe breakups a little bit less.
I have a whole set of poems that have never been published anywhere in the Voices in India, talking about killing your kids, actually. But, yeah, and so, sonic sequence, no less. Yes, sometimes you have to abandon whole poems, sometimes you abandon all but just one little image, and that becomes the core of the next version of the poem. I think that for this type of exercise, it's really useful for me to show 3 versions that really all do reach back to that original inspiration point. It would be a little more complicated for me to trace a poem where the whole idea behind the poem had changed each time. But yeah, sometimes you have to be open to wherever it takes you.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
You talk about like how important revising is, but then you also said you were really stubborn. How do you get past the point of like just being too stubborn to even want to go back and look at it? You know, like no, I like it. That's how it is. How do you?
Well, time is a beautiful distancer. As in, sometimes there are things that I'm just too close. I'm making too many excuses for the poem when it's a fresh draft. And I need to go on and write other things and fall a little bit out of love with that early draft, and then I can come back and recognize where its flaws were. But I do think that, when I talk about stubbornness and when I talk about having faith, that has more to do with trusting that your voice is meant to be a unique one in the world, and finding the ways in which you can defend and be your best argument for your voice, but recognizing that your voice can always be stronger. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like people who are competitive in the realm of sports, they practice at the end of the day, even though they also talk a big game and kind of defend their certain signature moves. Even when their coach, might be, it's that balance between like, do you change your swing because someone advises you that another one might be more efficient? And sometimes it's really hard to tell, like where the best decision is going to be made. Is it in you or is it in your editor or your coach? And it's trial and error, But I think that stubbornness, as in terms of perseverance, is good. Stubbornness in terms of inflexibility is not good. That can hurt you. So, yeah. So, Billy Collins. I taught this poem, and specifically I taught this 3 drafts thing at the Texas Christian University. And Billy Collins was supposed to come in. Haha, there is a video camera. Hi. So Billy Collins was supposed to come in and be the headlining presence for this conference, and he was great. We all thought that he would give a wonderful reading, which he did, and that he would fly out early the next morning. Instead, it turned out that he had a very early golf tee time for every subsequent day of the conference, which meant we essentially had him as a crasher. Like, he would get up early, he'd go to a round of golf, he'd be in a great mood, and he'd sit in on every single panel and every single reading, which was great. He's a very smart poet and a very smart man. But when it came time to do this panel on revision, the organizer said, "Hey, Billy, you want to sit in?" So he did. So I'm seated at one end of the table with my little exercise, and he's seated at the other end of the table with a couple of poets between us, and it gets down to him, and he picks it up and he goes, I love workshopping work, and it's just so rare that I just have the opportunity to have all these versions of a poem in front of me. And so there I am, and essentially Billy Collins workshops my poem on the spot in front of an audience, and like going line by line and saying, I would consider changing this. At one point he paused on the second draft and he said, I really, really like what she did here. Kind of silently critiquing the fact that I had then changed it, but he liked what I had done in the second version. Maybe he liked the wife, I don't know. So it was just this funny thing where it was part of me was like, I would have killed to have the experience of having a poem workshop by Billy Collins, and I would still kill in many ways for it. Would I have ideally done it on the fly in front of an audience of 140 people? Maybe not. So I just mentioned that to share the we're all made vulnerable by sharing our drafts. We all have it pointed out to us how things can be changed or improved, sometimes when we're expecting it, sometimes when we're not.
Did you sense he liked a version more than the other? Like, did you sense the second one was?
No, he was being fair. There were certain things that he liked about earlier versions, I think, and then certain things. But I wasn't trying to write a Billy Collins poem. I was trying to write a Sandra Beasley poem. So of course he would look at it, and there would be different decisions that he would have made. So.
Yeah, you should be mentally prepared for having something like that happen.
Yeah.
That would be. You know, one of the things we work on all the time, and I have no answer to this, and it's always asked, is sort of when you have the poem. Distance is great. When you're teaching a semester class, you can't have too much distance between.
Right.
You know, and so what we do is we have a poem written. Typically, there's a rough draft. Typically, there's a abandoned draft that then they have time to ignore until the portfolio comes. It's more a typical creative writing structure. Other than distance, how do I help them and me figure out which? I had a metaphor in my mind and then it died. Which harbors to leave? See, it's already stupid. Like, it's that idea of which to break up with and which not. I mean, does that get at least easier? A muscle that gets more, what do you call it when you work out?
Well, here's the funny thing. Taking a class in creative writing that is a semester long or even a year long has very little to do with the life of a writer once you're outside the school system. And I mention that because, you know, for example, when I have a book accepted, there's typically at least a year of lag time between when I submit the text of the book and when they tell me they want to publish it. And then there's another year of lag time before there's any chance of the book being out into the world. And so in the meantime, like, the poems are kind of, I might be reevaluating, I might be changing. There's limited extent to which I can or cannot reflect those changes in what turns up in the printed text. You have to, you know, you might have a poem that you love, you might spend 3 years sending it out and having it rejected over and over and over, and in the 4th year, Poetry Magazine takes it. I mean, it's a long game. Poetry is a long game. You can't worry about the immediate feedback of, oh, I like this poem, I perfected it, I sent it to the school literary journal, and it's going to be in print by the end of the month. Awesome. That's really great, but it's not going to be that type of quick turnaround if you go into the real world as a real poet. And the thing that I find myself saying over and over and over is that the point of a semester is not to perfect a particular set of poems. If you come in and your main goals are you know, how do I fix this poem? Tell me how this poem can be right. I will tell you that you're not looking for the right set of things. Because the poems that you consider your best right now will be just old husks of things 10 years ago, things that you used to be interested in if you keep moving through the world as a writer. And so some of the unhappiest poets I know are people who went to great programs, worked with amazing teachers, perfected a certain set of 43 pages of poems, and are still hauling those same 43 pages of poems around them like a corpse or a gorgon's head, you know, and waiting for them to be found by the rest of the world. They didn't keep moving forward. And so I just, you know, I don't have a perfect answer about like that distance, but I think...
You keep writing is the answer.
Yeah, you keep writing, and you just can't look towards any one class to give you a perfect set of texts. And you know, and that's a good segue into talking about. I do want to talk a little bit about the poems that were sent to me on behalf of the class. I saw great things going on, but what I want to be clear is what I'm not going to do. So originally, when we were talking about one of the structures that we talked about, me giving feedback to you was, well, what's the 4 best poems or the 5 best poems? There's problems with looking at things that way. One is that what might be the most polished poem right now might not be as good as a poem that right now has some technical flaws on the page, but has a much more interesting idea behind it. That poem might have further that it can go. You know, and so it's really hard to evaluate best, because best idea, best execution, best use of the capybara, you know, like there's all these different ways that we can evaluate.
I didn't expect that.
So what I want to do is introduce to you two different ways, but someone who I studied with and who taught me a lot about poetry taught me to think about poetry. And I'm going to use that to recognize a few of the poems that were sent to me in the packet. And then I want to point out that I will be following up with just some individual lines of feedback for poems. So I'm not going to hand back sheets of paper to you with something scribbled on it, but I will. I'll be working with Frank to make sure that you have some record of this conversation. So I studied with a guy named Gregory Orr at the University of Virginia, and as I mentioned earlier, a little bit of a science nerd. I also studied math, but I can add, it's great. No, I studied higher advanced calculus and other mathematical forms, and I was very interested in visual interpretation of mathematics. So, Greg had what he called the 4 temperaments of poetry. And I want you to picture the 2 axes, the x-axis and the y-axis, okay, of a graph. That's okay, it's okay. It's not so scary. Picture in one of those 4 quadrants, story. Picture in another of those 4 quadrants, structure. In another quadrant, music. In another quadrant, imagination. Story, so narrative, pace. Structure, so patterns, rhythm. Music, so sound, rhyme. Imagination, image, metaphor, simile, okay? Story, structure, music, imagination. What I would argue is that most beginning poets find themselves drawn over and over again to one of those quadrants. You write poems that are all about telling stories, or you write poems that are super rich with sound play. You're drawn to writing poems. You're fascinated by the sonnet. You want to figure out how to write a sonnet, how to make that jigsaw puzzle work. Or imagination. Your poems have these kind of wild metaphors and similes and are almost painterly, right? So I would say that most beginning poets fall in love with poetry because they're in love with one of those quadrants. Over time, maybe like if you choose to study poetry at the college level, you will find yourself acquiring like a second set of skills. Most poets who work at their craft a little bit, sooner or later find themselves working in 2 of those quadrants. If you're someone like me who goes into the world and is publishing and being exposed to a lot, you might, on a really good day, be working in 3 of those quadrants. If you're working in all four of those quadrants, you're probably Shakespeare. You should check because that would mean you're dead. But you know, no, I mean it's not just Shakespeare. But the point is that a poem that is perfectly balanced in how it's working all of those quadrants is a poem at the very highest order. And so maybe in that sense you could evaluate it as being a stronger, but you know, at the very least it'll endure. What I would encourage you to start doing is start asking yourself when you have a first draft, which quadrant is this draft operating in? Story, structure, music, imagination. What's another quadrant that this poem can start to work in? Where can I actively strengthen my number or my variety of images? Where can I actively strengthen the amount to which the story is evident? Does the outside reader get what is going on? Do I value if they get what is going on? Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to highlight very briefly, and what I'd like to do is, if you're in the room when I mention this, will you just raise your hand so that I have some sense of where you are and that you're present? I was curious, so talking briefly about the quadrant of story, I was curious about the poem by Josh Althoff, Fee Fi Fo Fum. Okay.
Oh, wow. What?
I sent sorry. For spring break, I sent.
Am I guessing that you all don't know which poems of yours you have read?
I just sent the ones. I sent lots of stuff.
Okay, and Vivian Drury, are you here? Okay. So I thought another war poem would be another poem that operates in that quadrant of story really well. Structure, form. Now, mind you, structure, form, that doesn't have to be obvious structure. It can be. So everybody who sent me poems that were working in that, was it Liesl Mueller? That, you know, the how to do this, that's a really good, obvious example of structure, a poem that's embracing that. I tended not to pick those because I was interested in poems that weren't doing an obvious mimicking of something. So in putting those aside for a minute, I was really interested in Annika mural. Okay, so I actually thought your Lamaze class one was really interesting on the level of structure. Gabby Granada. Okay, so I thought August Stars actually was really, now that's going to sound weird because it might look like there's not a lot of structure, but I thought where you made your stanza breaks was really interesting. And again, we'll cycle back around on this. Music and sound. Sage Anderson. Okay, I thought Musing as Muses that had a really strong sense of making sense through sound. There's a theory in cognitive science that when we hear rhyme, we hear closure. Oh yeah, and these packets are going out.
Stupid. Yeah, these are all, so you had no idea what I said, and I was too busy to tell you.
I am glad he's only passing these out now because if you'd had these in hand when we were talking about the translator, it would have been like, I would have been watching pages flip and nothing.
Oh yeah. I mean, I did it on purpose. Totally.
So he says.
Oh no, I don't want you to have these now.
Sorry.
I don't want people to see these.
Did you kill a small only?
Don't tell which ones you don't want to see.
Thank you, Manila.
No one's even gonna do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Stop yelling and go get it. Hey, are there any extras anywhere?
Oh, I have a couple of extras up here.
There's an extra at that table. Anybody? The order is my, no, there's no order.
Yeah, no, the order is random. I could tell that. So, okay, so just for those playing the home game, yeah, I had looked at for story, I looked at Josh Altoff's P5 Thumb, Vivian Drury's Another War Poem. For structure, I was interested in Annika Mural's Lamaze class and Gabby Granada's August Stars. So again, with structure, it doesn't have to be received form. It's not, when I'm talking about structure, I'm not just talking about is it a sonnet, is it in quatrain. I'm also talking about where are the line breaks, where are the stanza breaks. So it doesn't have to be a neat traditional form in order to have structure. Patterning, anaphora, those are all parts of structure. Music, or for sound, I mentioned Sage Anderson's Musing on Muses, which is interesting because a lot of times end rhyme is kind of pushing the arguments of the poem towards closure. I was also really interested in Bethany Tomasian, Thicker Than Water.
She had to go back to class.
She had to go back to class. Okay, so since she's not here, I'm just going to show you something really interesting. So her poem is called Thicker Than Water, and if you flip to it, it's towards the back.
Sorry.
It's a big, sprawly poem. And this brings me to another important way of thinking about poetry. We don't have a page number for this.
That's
That's okay.
not my fault.
It's about a millimeter from the back.
A millimeter from
It's very close to the back.
We're going by the length of this.
Tell her what it's next to. Thicker than water. Or something like that. Thicker than water.
Do we have it? Oh, we got it. All right.
Note to self.
Don't worry about it. Nobody needs to agonize. Okay, but here's the thing. So Thicker Than Water. We're not gonna read the poem, especially since Stephanie's not here. But here's what I want you to look at. When you just look at the poem visually, there's a lot of what I would call sprawl, and I don't mean that in a bad way. There's a lot of kind of language on the page. It's very dense. So I already mentioned that Gregory Orr has these 4 quadrants, right? There was another way that he liked to talk about poems, and that is, rather than being X and Y axis, a single axis with order at one end and disorder at the other. Now, I want to point out something really important. This is not a valuative vertical axis. This is not disorder is down here, order is up here, and the further you up, the better you are. It's not like that. It's lateral. order is here, disorder is here, and a given poem might choose to sit anywhere it wants along that axis. And similarly, every person in this room as a reader has a different preference for how much order or disorder they like in a poem. Have you guys ever been in a workshop discussion where like two people, it's really driving them nuts because they don't know who the speaker is in the poem, and then another person is like, I don't really care. I like the images. I like the language. I like what's going
It's
on.
funny, we don't get that's really interesting to say that. We don't, in workshop scenarios, get a lot of dissension. Like, it's still, we were like, really, I joke about, I like the font, that kind of thing. But we talk about how, someone will say something, and I think the ones that disagree, they don't say much, and the ones that agree, they affirm that they agree.
I suspect that right now that's because you as a group of readers probably have pretty much a very similar foundational experience, as in you've been taught to value the same, but hopefully you'll go forward and you'll all share my values because you were exposed to me all here. That came out wrong. You were not all exposed.
Got it on camera.
To me in this room. And I did not expose myself to you all. But we get the idea. We interacted. And so if you go forward as a lover of poetry, you will find yourself in a college workshop where, there's like representations of 4 or 5 or 8 different communities that had their own foundational text, their own closeness, and there are subtle values that result from that. You go a step further to an MFA program, and then you're going to have a workshop where every single person might be from a different part of the country, might have a different set of poets who they consider important poets. So I think that might be why you haven't, got that dissension going yet. And in some ways that's great. But if you choose to, so I think it's really important to know that down the road, if you're in a workshop and there's a tussle over like, is this good? Is this bad? Does this make enough sense? Does it make too much sense? Is it boring? Is it too obscure? Think of that less as getting at the question of, is the poem good? And more at, is it getting at the question at, where does this poet's style sit on that axis between order and disorder? And is this a good match of a reader for that poem? As in, does their need for order versus disorder sit in approximately the same place on the axis? Does that make sense?
What about the reader part again? Can you say the reader part again? Is
Yeah,
there a need?
so if every poet has an optimal place that they tend to return to again and again for the balance between order and disorder, every reader has similarly a balance point of what they crave from the poem in terms of the amount of order.
This is not about me always, but how do we teach?
Well, part of what's really helpful is you can teach it visually. I mean, it is and what's really useful is to come up with some examples from kind of canonical great American poetry and ask, like for example, Hart Crane would be a tremendously disordered poet. E.E. Cummings might be a tremendously disordered poet in some ways. A really ordered poet might be someone like Robert Frost. So I mean, it helps if you kind of start putting some exemplars up there, but be understanding that they're not binding definitions.
Right.
It's easier once you,
Are you supposed to average the two or something, or like how do you find a happy medium? Is there a happy medium?
Is there a happy medium between order and disorder?
Between what the reader thinks and between what you as the person who wrote the poem.
I don't know if it's a happy medium, but there's some type of negotiation that takes place. You know what I mean? Like I think one of the trickiest things about revising and workshopping your poetry is that you do want to court your reader a little bit, but you don't want to pander to them, right? It's like the early stages of forming a romantic relationship with someone. You want to flirt to show you're interested. You don't want to be completely standoffish and hard to get, but at the same time, you don't want to be following them around like a puppy dog. You got to kind of figure that balance of like, how do I offer you some of what I have, some of what this poem has to offer, and then make you work a little bit to get the rest of it, right? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? It's just a bit I don't abandon. So I brought up Bethany's poem because I think it's a great example of a poem that's really working in the aesthetic of disorder, as well as having a lot of rich music, a lot of really interesting sound choices. The other quadrant that I have not spoken about is imagination, which is often indicated by strength of image. And the two poems that stuck out for me in terms of that were Dirk Malek's Skater and Julia Staiano's Pity. And these were not the only poems that I noted. There were other really strong poems. They were just the poems that happened to speak particularly well to this idea of these quadrants and these temperaments. So we've got about 15 minutes left, right? Yeah. So I'm curious if anybody would like, of the poems that I've mentioned, if there's anybody who is game to read a poem, to share it, and then maybe to come up here and read it for your audience. I realize that you were all caught off guard, so you don't have to read the poem. But if you want to share it, maybe we can just talk briefly about something that's working in the poem, or...
Like if you want a poem sort of informally workshopped by someone who knows it all.
Okay, somebody knows it all. Okay, all right, so we have some quick volunteers. And are you game to read the poem that I had indicated?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure, well, come on up. That'd be fun. Yeah. Yeah, you're going to have to indicate where it is.
It's on the second page. 354 from, and that was the trending title because I couldn't think of anything else that a giant would say. That's the unhappy truth. So, it's about the Jack and the Beanstalk. This is the fairy tale exercise we did. The giant's wife stared down in torn horror from the cloudy sky with a massive green stalk fallen on top of her husband, and she suddenly forgave all the times when he had come home late with the scent of Englishman's bones on his breath, and even the time when he made her grind up the bleachy sticks into his bread. She knew that no sack of gold could bring back his clumsy affections, like when he ripped through a queen's garden to bring her a bush of flowers, and she had laughed because the little bugs in the roots were much more concerned with holding on to the flowers than the giant suspending them. And even though he had never taken her to a ball or bought her new dresses or shown her the land world like Jack had, she couldn't forgive that ratty thief who leaned easily on his axe, laughing with his mother at the giant's fate to the tune of a sickly harp, while somewhere on their little plot of land a hen strutted around, laying golden eggs in the dirt. And nobody would give the shiny lumps any second thought until they were unceremoniously stolen away. An overgrown plant had taken her husband from her, and she resolutely realized that the only way to weep by his side was to jump.
Okay, so I think there's a lot to admire about that poem. I think that, and just for time's sake, I'm going to kind of keep my comments brief. But one interesting question for me is when you're telling a poem, or when your poem is telling a known story, how do you figure out when to open? How do you figure out how to structure? One thing that this poem does is it uses in media res. It opens in the middle, right? The giant's wife stared down in torn horror. We're already thrust into the aftermath of something. And then what the poem is trying to do is simultaneously develop the backstory, talk about what the giant's wife relationship to her husband was, where the risk or the dramatic conflict was, and then also kind of set up for us where the story's going to go. And I think that's a challenging technical feat that the poem addresses really well. It never feels overly slowed down in terms of relating the backstory. She had laughed because the little bugs in the roots were much more concerned with holding on to the flowers than the giant suspending them. And even though he had never taken her to a ball or bought her new dresses or shown her the land world like Jack had, she couldn't forgive that ratty thief who leaned easily on his axe, laughing with his mother at the giant's fate to the tune of the sickly heart. So there's all these little, we get these little pauses for, well, the husband never really really appreciated her as an attractive figure. Never bought her pretty clothes, but all of a sudden her sympathies she's reminded that her sympathy is with her husband because Jack and his, I mean, it's really cool. Like, it's really cool how much ground is being covered by the poem. And so that's why I think that in terms of that quadrant of story, is this poem fully operating at its strength in terms of the quadrant of structure? Maybe not yet. You know, when I look at it on the page, there's not a strong ordering sense of what's going on your right hand or your left hand margin. It's kind of one long, incredible sentence, and I like that. But maybe there's room for stanza breaks, you know, like maybe there's room for a little bit of parallel play. But I think that the images are great, the story's great, maybe the music and the structure are still emerging. Did others notice anything in particular about this poem as he was reading it? It's always tricky to take things in all at once.
Mm-hmm.
It was sprawling, and I thought that kind of reflected like her looking down, like all the way down,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I was waiting for that stop, like when you came to the end of the line, I was waiting for it, and I felt like the cinematic movie in my head was the flowing down of the beanstalk as well, like the camera sort of zooms down all the way down.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting that she resolutely realized that the only way to weep by his side. Now those are moments where there is a lot of music. You have the internal consonants of resolutely and realized. You have the assonance of sighed and realized. So assonance being the repetition of vowel sounds, consonants being the repetition of consonant sounds. These are all ways that when poets choose to move to the realm of free verse, we're still giving our poems energy and structure and rhythm and kind of internal rigor without using the more obvious meter and rhyme. So yeah, so I really enjoyed it. Okay, so we had another. Did you want to read the poem? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, step on up.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah. Hi friends. Okay, this one's called Lama's Class. It's like in the middle of the packet. I don't know how to pronounce all these words. So.
This is a good exercise, though, to kind of to locate. I wanted this to all be a metaphor for how one finds the poem that wants to be written, right?
Okay, literally, totally. Smack it.
Good try.
Thanks, dude.
What?
So it's called Class Class. Every week, Lama's class meets. Bellies swollen with galactic mysteries giving way to gravitational pull as bumps hit the carpet. While ladies stretch and breathe, worlds form inside of them. Milky Ways solidify, dark matter fills with substance. How are the heavenly bodies this week? The twins, Demios and Phobos. Have they found anything in the latest satellite? Some focus, practice yoga ball perches, ignore the kicks of Saturn's rings and orbital rotation of Neptune. One lady is absent. 3 months early, she gave birth to a Pluto, without an ozone or significant mass, a birth of emptiness. The doctors told her she had a black hole. Yeah.
Wow.
So the poem opens with this kind of clever conceit, this idea of like a cosmic Lama's class. And the part of the reason why I wanted to look at this poem in the context of structure is it does something that I think is really important, which is that the stanza by stanza, the poem is willing to turn kind of its syntactical, like it's not that every single stanza neatly follows the episodic train of thought. We're not always in the mode of narrative action that is advancing. You have these kind of turns towards the rhetorical question. You have these turns towards like backstory information. And then, the poem manages to land with a note, this idea of like giving birth to a black hole, which maybe represents some type of miscarriage or loss, and so we do get some degree of narrative resolution, but I think the poem is much more interested in playing with this universe that it has created and kind of letting each stanza do its own little thing. And I think that's a really good energy to try out. Is a lot of times when we talk about poems that have a more meditative quality, it's because each stanza is kind of examining. Think of it as an object with a prismed or faceted surface. And rather than a poem that is trying to take the object from point A to point B, the poem is kind of interested in turning the object different ways towards the light and reflecting. And so that to me is what's really great and working about that poem. And there are individual phrases that when you read them, I love them, and I am unfortunately one of the people who was not able to find this page.
I saw you looking, and I'm like, oh god.
That's all right. It's okay. But I will send some notes
Yeah.
about some of the particular phrases. No, it's really nice work. Yeah. Do we have other volunteers from the poems that I mentioned? Yeah.
Do you want to try?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It's right after Josh's.
It's like the page after.
Which one is it?
Another more poem.
Oh,
Oh, so you are gonna read.
Yeah.
She was gonna give it to you to read, so, but she's.
I found my mother glaring at the poison laptop glow, closely cloaked within a sheet of basement darkness, feeding her fear and envy, collapsing her deflated vows. With every scan of her frail blue eyes against the screaming white enemy emails, the diamond on her left ring finger shined dimmer and dimmer as it slowly slipped off. Chanel camouflage smeared after a 25-war deemed marriage, or as he calls it, a good run. Over time, cannons firing, depositing grenades of glitches and secrets, and an additional she, murdering the once nuclear family by the simple sound of clicking computer keys. Her hands feeble, clutching the mouse, like a revolver in a battle's final seconds, with the white flag labeled right before the white flag labeled divorce decree in thick black Times New Roman is forced into the ground of our suburban residence, with the cliche disclaimer, "It's not your fault, kids," barely fitting in the fine print. She stared up at me for a moment, a witness to the combat, with each side of my genetics, shooting against each other, scarring all until only the truth was left, shedding its light that was once hidden behind a screen and a folder labeled inbox with the subject of infidelity. Thank you.
so that's great. And this will be a good. So we've already recognized two poems where the characters. One was a character that was familiar to us through mythology or through fairy tale. Another in which the characters were kind of a construction. They were kind of this kind of intellectual idea of a character. This is a case where I care about these characters as people, right? Like I'm just immediately, my sympathy is drawn on a very human level to this household, this mother and maybe presumably this child who's witnessing. And I think that I want to thank the poet for being able to share the poem because I think that poems like this are really trying to say, how do I take something that is, whether or not it's drawn from real life, it reflects a very real pain, a recognizable pain, but finds a way to elevate it, finds a way to move it into that realm of poetry, finds a way to notice some subtle aspect of the process of discovery. I think what is so interesting is that a lot of times when we're learning about betrayals on the scale of an infidelity or of a loss in the family, it's often the most painful moment might be a very small one, might be a very subtle one. And I wanted, actually, this poem resonated in particular with me because of a poem that I have in Theories of Falling. And I'll tell you a backstory, which is that for years before it got published, I circulated this manuscript under the name The Reveal, but I had no poem that was called The Reveal, and no poem that used the phrase. But I was interested in the topic of revelation, discovery maybe of things that were painful. One day, towards the end of putting together the poems that would become this manuscript, I wrote a poem that finally used the phrase, the reveal. And the moment I did, I realized I needed to change the name of the book because that poem was about the revelation of a father's infidelity. And I knew that if I published this collection of poems with that, it's essentially becoming the title poem, that any review, any critical look at the book would frame the whole book as in some ways being about that. And I wasn't prepared for that to be the case. So part of the reason why this book became Theories of Falling is because of the poem that I'm about to share for you. Now, anybody ever used an old school camera with film that was actually on a roll? Yeah, okay, right? Yeah, our camera guys. So you used to buy rolls of film in units of 24 or 12 or 24 or 36, and when you sent the photos off to be developed, you'd get back the envelope that had 12 or 24 or 36 photos. The number of negatives equaled the number of photos, or at least it should. But if the number of photos was less than the number of negatives, you knew that certain images had been removed. Speaking of, I wish we had our science folks still here. The title of this poem is The Green Flash, which is a real meteorological phenomenon. The green flash. My father says that when yellow sun meets the blue sea at clearest dusk, you can see a green flash. Even now, I turn my eyes dutifully to the horizon. I always flipped to the last page first. I swallowed watermelon seeds, then waited. I split open a family of Matryoshka dolls and tapped the baby's head, hoping it too was hollow. If you sealed a cat in a box and never peeked, it would live forever, but I'd be picking at the lock by day 2. I read about Orpheus and stood in front of the mirror, glancing over my shoulder just to see Eurydice drop away. I studied Houdini's act, easing chains, slipping knots, never revealing the secret of his escape. How could he resist? I liked the trick, but what I loved was the reveal. In his office, my father found the roll of photographs, 21 images of smiling fidelity, and stopped there. Not me. I wanted to see those other 3 frames. I dug around for the negatives. I went to the window. I held my father up to that ruthless sun and looked and looked. And so I think part of what was so resonant for me about this poem was, in a way, it was looking at an eternal human dynamic. The trust and sometimes the betrayal that comes to a family or a love unit through a very particular lens of the technology. In the case of the student's poem, through the lens of email, which, 10 years from now, you might find yourself having to explain to someone what an email folder is, the same way that I have to explain to you what a roll of camera film is. But using that very temporary, temporal, technological lens to view a hurt that is recurring and far more long-lasting. So I think that is a great place for us to wrap. Thank you so much for all of your time and great questions. I look forward to talking with you more.